Okay, so we should be live right now, which means that momentarily on my Twitter account, it should go ahead and spit out a link, and I'm going to go drop that link right here to you guys over in Twitter, so you guys can go both put that on your platforms, and you have the link in Twitter, which I believe you should be able to go share, but that link doesn't seem as quite as good as, oh no, here's the best link.
That seems
okay. Seems to work. Wonderful. Well, welcome, folks, to the Global Gorillas live stream, where we have John Robb and we have special guest Mike Shelby. Now, for any questions you have on this live stream, the best place to drop those is going to be on the Twitter accounts of John Robb at John Robb or Mike Shelby at Gray Zone Warlord. And then as we get to go taking some questions, I'll be going and looking through those accounts to go and get some questions. So first off, for folks who are either coming from Mike's side and don't know who John Robb is, or they're coming from John Robb's side and they don't know who Mike is, let's get some introductions out of the way. Mike, what can you tell us about yourself and why, for the topic of the day, Afghanistan, OODA Shear, assumption rot, why you're a great person to go be talking about that?
Yeah, sure. I was an intelligence analyst, and I spent 2.5 years in Afghanistan. My first tour was at an interrogation facility, and then my last tour as a contractor, we were hunting down bomb builders with biometrics and other things. And so, I bring the intel, kind of the behind the scenes intel picture, I would imagine.
Yeah. And tell us more also about what you're currently doing with Forward Observer.
Yeah, I run Forward Observer, where we track political, social, and economic instability. So we track extremist groups. We track what the radicals in politics are doing. We track, we provide economic warning, with regards to the market bubble and monetary policy, what the dollar's very likely to happen to the dollar over the next several years. And really what our main product is called early warning. And we talk about things before they happen. That's our goal.
I love it. What's really interesting here and why I wanted to listen in on the conversation with you and John Robb is that John has a lot of real world experience, but then talks a lot about conceptual frameworks for when the world is going on. And some of your products, they talk more about what is happening, not at a conceptual level, but at a real life, what's happening right now level. And I think the juxtaposition with our topics today is going to be amazing. Now, John, for folks who are coming from Mike's side, can you give a quick introduction about yourself?
Okay. Air Force Academy, astronautical engineering, flew special ops, Delta Tier 1 kind of operations for many years. I got out, was a tech analyst right at the beginning of the bubble. So I was kind of like the first internet analyst through 95 through 97 for Forrester. Made my full living on the internet back in 95 and haven't stopped since then. And then I started a bunch of companies. One was in the internet finance space. It grew pretty big, sold for like 300 million, and then didn't get all out of that, but it's nice to be able to found it and get it going. Didn't collapse. And then I got involved in social networking in 2001. So based on a report I wrote back in 96, and I helped get that going. Oh, wow. We did RSS and the early blogging stuff. And then, during the Iraq War and Afghanistan, and I started writing a blog called Global Gorillas. Got pretty popular. Ended up in a book, Brave New War. That got pretty popular with all the 3-letter agencies, the DoD, all the different branches. So I ended up consulting with everybody at some point or another, giving speeches and the like. And now I run the Global Gorillas Report, and I write about the intersection of warfare, politics, and technology. So I have a bunch of different careers, doing a bunch of different things, and I tend to think about them in a holistic way. So hopefully I can help people figure things out. I did that during my early days in Forrester. when things were changing so fast, all the tech companies, all the regular companies, everybody was kind of frozen in place. So I had to help them figure out how to move forward, how to make decisions, how to unfreeze. And that's what I'm trying to do today with all the changes that are going on.
I love it.
How's the sound level on my mic? Good?
Sound level's great.
Great.
Sound level's good for both of you. So you have a bit over 24 people somewhere in there right now. So the first question, and it changes every time. So for the folks who are watching this later, we're recording this at 10 o'clock Pacific on the 3rd, because it could be wildly different an hour from now. From both of your perspectives, what's the high level, what just happened in Afghanistan? I know you both have been discussing this for 20 hours a day for a couple weeks at least, but just at a very high level so we can use that to dive into these other concepts of OODA Shear and assumption rot. What's the high level, what just happened?
Go ahead.
Oh, well, yeah, I think, I would defer to John here because OODA Shear.
Oh, before we get into those, two terms and the concepts, I just wrote a piece on Afghanistan that went into City Journal. It's also in report format and at my report for supporters. Is that what we had is a 3-phase rollout of problems, mostly in the decision-making space. We had these long-running, slow-moving guerrilla war coupled with nation building. A lot of us got in really early saying nation building wasn't working. You're hearing feedback from people coming back from Afghanistan and saying, hey, nation building isn't working. I got to testify in front of the Armed Services Committee in 2009. They asked me about Afghanistan. What should we do? I said, just feed the warlords, get our troops out. Just give us some cover. Get out as quickly as possible because nation building is not going to work there. And then there was this failure to recognize that the guerrilla war was lost. And guerrilla war is it's fought in the moral dimension. It's the best way I can describe it is that you think of two big planets, each exerting a gravitational attraction, and they're trying to pull on each other. And that what you're trying to do with your side is to try to create as many forces of attraction that you could make by acting in a moral way, an unselfish way, supporting the people. And then you're trying to make the other side look selfish and corrupt to break apart their planet. And when that concludes, it's often very, very quick. The government on the other side or the force on the other side just collapses. It just disappears. It's eviscerated, gets pulled in to the opposing planet. And we saw that happen in Afghanistan with the speed of which the Taliban took the country showed that, it was a complete victory in the guerrilla war. There wasn't really anything holding together the government and military forces arrayed against them. And that we didn't recognize that going in. And, when it started to occur, became evident we didn't make decisions that allowed us to adapt to that new situation. We relied on the diplomacy that was ongoing, and I can understand that. I've been there plenty of times before, where when there's a struggle between State Department and the DoD, and the State Department goes, "Okay, we're in charge. Don't mess up our negotiations. We'll figure it out. We'll handle the situation." They tried to stop the collapse and through negotiation, and it didn't work. And then we had this whole maneuver phase, and I call it maneuver, but it's within this context, it's a lot of prepositioned equipment. It's a lot of people that were infiltrated in, and when it came time to take a new region, they activated, they turned up, and they kept us off balance as they took province after province, major city after major city. From I think August 9th to 15 was when most of the major cities fell. And that occurred so quickly that it disrupted and disoriented U.S. decision-making. We were caught, completely flat-footed. We didn't have any contingencies in place, nothing that allowed us to ensure that the troops and the people that were in Kabul or across the country trying to evacuate could get out safely, that we didn't make any moves, didn't take any action that put those contingencies and redundancies in place. And that was a second decision-making failure. And that finally, when we're surrounded in Kabul, it's like August 15th, they're here. There's some talk about, whether or not we said, go ahead, take the city or not. And there was still a failure to recognize that having our troops confined to an airport or just around the airport area and then surrounded by Taliban in a city of 5 million people was a dangerous situation. A completely scary situation in the sense that, all they had to do was knock out that major airport. And there were some defenses in place and they talked them up, but, concerted effort would have taken it out. Any kind of attempt to, counter battery or, attack on the forces that were trying to shut down the airport would have been firing into a city of 5 million people, would have been a bloodbath. We would have looked horrible. It wouldn't have been tenable. All we could do is then shut down that airport and allow it to cut us off, allow them to cut us off from the rest of the world. We didn't really have anything in place or in the region. Most of the adjacent countries are semi-hostile, and they're not permissive of a U.S. mission to offer air support or other things. And so most of our missions were being flown from, carriers or bases that are, 700 to 1,000 miles away. Just the logistics of that are horrific. And I think the negotiation posture going into Kabul, being surrounded, was that we're going to maintain the evacuation and maintain our stance that we'll hold all our cards and we'll, punish the Taliban later. I think that all reversed over the course of that 2-week evacuation. That in order to keep those troops and keep those civilians safe, as the news began to tighten, as they, took more and more of the city, and they took more and more control over the security and in control of that airport, shutting down the civilian side, slowing inflow into the gates through, mobs, and then through checkpoints, and eventually through bombs, through proxies, is that we gave up the farm. We basically said, okay, we're going to recognize you as a sovereign state, that, the entity in charge of Afghanistan that we internationally recognize, that we'll open up the financial floodgates, we'll unfreeze all your assets and take you off of terrorist watch lists and other things and other kind of, restrictions that we had on the Taliban the last time they were in control. And that for optics reasons, we won't see that for the next few months, but they're coming. And that essentially, we were rolled, and we gave up everything in order to get those people out. Again, decision-making failure at the get-go about the guerrilla war, decision-making failure during the maneuver phase, and decision-making failure during the kind of siege phase, not acting with alacrity to get out of there as soon as possible to preserve our diplomatic leverage. So that's just my synopsis of how it rolled out. And Mike, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great synopsis. There were a lot of people who came out and said what happened in Afghanistan was an intelligence failure. And that's what we heard from a lot of places. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. What it looks like to me is really a brokered surrender, because now we have reports coming out that Biden told Ashraf Ghani, who was the president of Afghanistan, but essentially, according to the leaked details of this call, stand down. The Taliban's going to be the new government. And I thought that was interesting because back during when the Taliban were taking over large swaths of the country very rapidly, there were ANA soldiers who, and I can't confirm this is true, also can't deny it, but there were ANA soldiers and they said they were told to stand down, that there was a deal being brokered by the Afghan government and the Americans. And so as John said, I really look forward to what actually surfaces over the next couple of months, because this does not look like an intelligence failure. This looks like a policy failure. This looks like the Biden administration not hanging on to this dream of Afghanistan and basically saying, well, it's better just to rip the Band-Aid off very rapidly rather than try to let it linger. Also look at Kabul as kind of like DC. What we saw at the district level and even the village level over the past 20 years are effective Taliban governance. They had the shadow government. And it was so bad that in some cases in these villages, villagers would, if there was a dispute, they would not go to the Afghan National Police. They wouldn't go to the official Afghan government. They would go to the Taliban shadow judge, or they would have this dispute resolved by the local Taliban. And so when you have a competing, I mean, effectively at this point, you're competing for legitimacy, which is a textbook definition essentially of an insurgency. And so being that the Taliban were never really eradicated, they had very strong vertical ties in a lot of these communities. And in many cases, the people of Afghanistan, not in every case, but in many cases, they looked at the Taliban as an effective governing structure. That is a recipe for disaster. Just like DC can't control what's happening in Travis County, Kabul can't dictate to exactly what's happening on the ground in the Arghandab Valley in Kandahar. And so this is we tend to try to go into countries, and I've been reading a lot about what happened in Algeria and Malaya and some of these other insurgencies. And the West tends to go in and try to make a government in the image of a Western democracy, and it just does not work for these people. And so it was a failure of policy from the get-go. And I would say not an intelligence failure. And I think that truth is going to be borne out as we hear more about this leaked details of exactly what was happening behind the scenes with the Department of State and the Afghan government.
Before we hop into some of these questions around definitions, we have a question from the audience about how long has the brokered surrender been in process, which I read that and I think, how long have I been confused about what was going to happen? Have I been confused for like a month or more like a decade?
I think that the recognition that things were going bad was pretty universally known. It's just that people continued to express the optimism, and it was kind of career suicide to come out and say, oh, Afghanistan is a disaster, we got to get out. We just saw that recently with somebody who demanded some kind of accountability. I think it was a lieutenant colonel put up a video. In terms of the mechanics of this, the retreat from Afghanistan, I think it was a gradual kind of realization, and that it started off with the diplomatic group focusing on trying to come up with a ceasefire arrangement during the takeover phase, and that they were constantly trying to cool things down. And every time they thought they had something, it was taken away and taken away and taken away. Stand down the ANA, because the Taliban said they would stand down. And as soon as they did that, it was like, boom, the province would be gone, or the city would be gone. And it went on and on and on, all the way up to Kabul. And then, then it was, how do we get those troops out? And that was the full surrender. That was a full capitulation. And it wasn't just surrendering Afghanistan. It was surrendering all of our diplomatic options once we got out. That kind of, taking them off the terrorist watch list, a lot of talk about Taliban 2.0. This isn't the same Taliban. They're not going to be quite as bad. We expect them to uphold international law and international agreements. All of that talk started to surface there during the 2 weeks of Kabul. It's easy to. I think it's probably not correct to say that it was negotiated and done right at the get-go back in May. When the offensive started. So it's. I think it's kind of a gradual process of diplomacy not working. This cool down. They didn't want the government to flip during the evacuation. They thought they had things under control through negotiation, and they tried to slow it down and freeze it for the withdrawal, and they weren't able to do it. And it was just a rolling disaster. And the military sat there and did nothing during the entire process, as their options got fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer until there were none, until they were totally sealed into a box around the airport.
Do you mean our military or the Afghan military?
Our military. I mean, I'm assuming that the Afghan military was beaten. It was just a hollow shell. It just had to, you just had to push on the edifice, and the thing would collapse.
Mike, any further thoughts, Mike, on that question about brokered surrender and how long this has been the plan?
Well, I mean, yeah, the Trump administration had been negotiating with the Taliban, but they're negotiating on the false assumption that the Taliban would stick to any kind of agreements. The U.S. has no say as far as the Taliban is concerned. They can agree to whatever they want to, but the U.S., once they leave, they have absolutely no say whatsoever. Now, the U.S. government can kind of string them along with this carrot, promising foreign aid and international recognition and a seat at the table and all the diplomatic stuff. But it's absolute folly, I think, to trust the Taliban on anything. As far as the negotiation is concerned.
Yeah, they've been, in terms of their tactics on the ground during the guerrilla campaign, they had a lot of emphasis on trying to minimize civilian casualties, on projecting appearance of incorruptibility, and that served to kind of build them up and make their momentum stronger. It also gave the kind of false impression to the U.S. that is going to be the policy once they took control. It's a whole different ball game once they're in control. All of that restraint that was necessary to win the guerrilla war isn't necessary for maintaining control of the country once you're in charge, and that a different group of people starts to take over, and they're all of the brutality that we saw before will begin to surface. That's why there's this ongoing effort to get people out, to smuggle them out, and it's going to be very similar to what we saw like with Eastern Europe, or East Berlin is getting people out on a constant basis because of the brutality and the oppression that's going to occur there.
If I can add one thing, Brian, to this, we can't view the Taliban government and Taliban fighters as this monolithic organization, because their command and control is not linear like we have in the West. There's decentralized command. There's what you might even call distributed command. There were times where we had Taliban attacking each other in some districts over who is going to be the district commander, and so there will be lingering Taliban. I wouldn't call them splinter groups, but there are going to be people they're going to be Taliban who do not follow the guidance from on high in Kabul, from this new Taliban government. So all this talk about minimizing civilian casualties and whatever the Taliban promised the United States they're going to do, again, is worthless, because the government is not going to be able to control every single Taliban faction through the entire country. It's not like the army.
Yeah, exactly. It's very similar to a feudal system. And a feudal system, it works on entirely different principles than what we're used to in the kind of mechanized West and the kind of modern world. A feudal system is very decentralized, and that you have effective control because the leaders of XYZ group express fealty or promise fealty to, which is like a pledge of loyalty to act on their behalf locally, and that there's lots of competition between the different warlords, over who's actually the one representing that local area, and that who is going to best represent the or take be the most loyal, or be the best at executing the larger plan. But it's a loose system. It's very decentralized. It's not like I don't have a, you don't have a bureaucracy. There isn't an order that goes down through the chain of command like we have in the Western militaries. You can even see it with the individual jihadi attacks. A lot of times there would be a video after the attack or during the attack where the bomber or the one who's conducting the attack will express fealty and take a pledge and put their life on the line for the caliphate in that case. So it's a different kind of notion than what we see in the West, at least for 1,000 years.
We're using our current mindset to go view people who are operating just differently, Mike, as you're saying, and that I have no experience in what actually living in a tribal warlord society looks like. I can read about my ancestors in Scotland a long, long time ago, but that is nothing like actually negotiating in real time with them and assuming that I understand what they want or what their sense of honor is. Because my sense of honor as an American who is in this structure, it's not obvious that sense of honor and their sense of honor bear anything in resemblance. Which brings us to assumptions. And I'd love to go hear more about both two phrases, John, that you've come up with recently, assumption rot and OODA Shear, and how those can be useful for understanding what's happening in Afghanistan, but also the rest of the world as things are happening quickly in all kinds of domains. So which one of those two sounds best to dive into first?
Yeah, let's do OODA Shear. It's more tactical, more operational. Assumption rot's like a bigger concept that applies to almost everything that we're experiencing right now. OODA Shear is based on the decision-making process that John Boyd, which is America's best strategic mind, came up with back in the late 20th century. The process is OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. It's a very simplified decision-making model. His idea is his framework has warfare is basically a contest of minds. One mind versus another, one group of minds versus another group of minds. They're all running through decision-making loops. The side that goes through runs through a decision-making loop both faster or better, making better decisions, will win the contest. It's much more important than the amount of equipment you have, much more important than the number of troops in many cases, although those physical factors may be the deciding factors in certain engagements, but for larger wars, it's this decision-making. You can even see it with the Miyamoto Musashi and all the Book of Five Rings. It's like the decision-making you make at the individual level applies to the level of armies and battalions. So OODA Shear is what happens when you observe something and then you go to orient. And the orientation step, I think, is the most important. It's where all your training and all of your experience and everything that who makes you who you are comes into play in the decision-making process. It points you in the right direction. So you can see if you make a wrong decision or if you make a wrong assumption in the orientation phase, you can be pointed in the wrong direction and get further and further away from the correct decision. If you go faster, you'll be moving away faster from the correct decision. What I pointed out was that the U.S. military leadership in Afghanistan suffered a breakdown in the orientation phase, that their assumptions about what was going on were outdated, were not true anymore, and their brains could not accept it. It's kind of like a deer in the headlights kind of phenomena. The car is moving so fast, and with the lights shining, it's too much for the deer to process, and they just freeze and they just stare at the car while the car comes in and smacks them. And that's very similar to what we saw with the U.S. Military leadership, is that they were caught with old assumptions, and they couldn't update them. Either internal processes prevented them from doing so, or they were unwilling to re-engage with the problem because of the potential career risk associated with getting involved in Afghanistan, and that they just froze in place and hoped that it would go away, that the diplomacy would work, and that nothing actually would come out of this. So we ended up with this kind of deer in the headlights military leadership, what I call OODA Shear, all through the entire retreat. That encapsulate it for you, or do you want me to?
I want to hear Mike's perspective on that concept, and Mike fleshing that out with whatever your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, sure. I think OODA Shear is a really great way to explain what happened. If you look at the OODA cycle, observe is, for me, from my perspective, observe is intelligence gathering, orient is intelligence analysis, and then decide and act, that's ops stuff. So I really can't talk about ops stuff. What happens at the observe phase will affect the orient phase, because it's hard for me as an analyst to analyze a lack of information. If we have a bunch of intelligence gaps and standing requirements that have not been satisfied, it's very difficult for me to take nothing and turn it into something. There are some cases where that may not be true, but one thing I did wonder is, during the pullout of Afghanistan, how many of our intelligence assets were shifted to great power competition, with a new focus? Or listen, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we always had a problem: not enough ISR assets, right? There were not enough drones. There were not enough collection platforms. You had to fight and claw your way and beg, borrow, and steal, and just to try to get your requirements, your collection requirements filled. And so I do wonder if part of what happened during the Afghanistan in the past month, this debacle is geared towards just not having enough ISR. And I don't know if that's the case or not. But if that is the case, then that certainly would lead to a breakdown of the orientation phase, which is trying to understand what's happening. Another thing that I think may have been a problem or contributed to a problem is every intel shop, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about civilian or military intelligence, every single shop has what's called an analytic line. And in 2008, I was writing the executive intelligence summaries for General Petraeus. And I remember going through this stuff and writing down what I thought was important, what I thought he needed to know. And I remember on numerous occasions, I would submit it to the ace chief, and our ace chief would say, "No, you can't say that," or "That's right, but you can't say it like that," or "No, this is not going up to him," even though it was the intelligence that the shop produced. So,
speaking as a civilian who's not been in the military, that blows my mind that the generals would not be getting the variety. My imagination is the general's the person who's getting all the different reports, all the different perspectives, and then they're going, and not that they're getting good intel censored. They should get bad intel censored, but good intel obviously makes it to all the way to the commander-in-chief, is what I, as a civilian, perceive it ought to be like. So to hear that story, I'm just thinking, oh no. And I bet you'll tell me that's not only that one time, but that that's normal.
Well, it is normal to have an analytic line. And look, sometimes you have an analytic line to constructive narrative, because that's not what someone's boss wants to hear, right? The boss says, "Hey, this is all I want to hear. This is the analytic line." And anything that deviates from that is suppressed. And right. I'm not saying this is what happened in Afghanistan, but look, for the past decade, we've had generals and other people and telling Congress that, oh, the Afghan National Security Forces are great. We heard from Biden. There's 300,000 of them. They're strong. They could, and then talk about assumption rot. Right. Maybe that was never even the case. Maybe that assumption was not even the case to rot. But just in terms of OODA Shear, there's a couple of points where the OODA loop can break down for senior leaders, for sure.
Right. Yeah. The party line comes into play in everything. I did some report writing for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, basically looking at, I helped write the report on autonomous weapons, looking out 20 years, which was the first time they've ever really done that, and how they would be used in warfare. And the publishing process was horrific, with all these different players coming in and saying, you can't use that word, or you can't say this. It's got to be rephrased. It has to be done in this way in order to get buy-in, whatever. It was nuts. It was absolutely nuts. What prevented any kind of really high quality conceptual thinking, to be injected into the document. How do you fight with these weapons in a new way? That's kind of like how you would use tanks and aircraft in blitzkrieg warfare. You're trying to interject it. You kind of put it in there and show them kind of how it works that way. But it wasn't possible. It stopped right at the very front from all this editing. Yeah, I agree.
Now that you've thoroughly disheartened all the civilians listening, let's talk some about assumption rot and some of the particular things that both of you guys see in your fields, both defining the term, but then also how Afghanistan really hit us in the face with it, but then also how it applies to other current events and what's happening in the rest of this year.
Yeah. Okay. So assumption rot, it kind of hit me when I was, in the process of kind of covering the retreat from Afghanistan, and is how we wouldn't ask the big questions. And it was pretty obvious. You didn't have to have even better intel to kind of see what was going on in Afghanistan, even from afar, even using open source means. You could see that the guerrilla war was lost. You could see the maneuver war proceeding very quickly. You could see this, a little bit of projection. You could see the siege. It was really super clear from the evidence that was available. Is that, we wouldn't ask, core questions about, what was going on, what was clearly going on. And that mirrored things I was seeing everywhere. We wouldn't ask core questions about, the financial crisis or the Iraq war. What does Iraq have to do with 9/11 kind of thing? And what happened in the financial crisis? There were, all the banks and tens of thousands of brokers and people in the investment banks were selling stuff they knew that was fraudulently bad to pension funds that could only buy AAA. I mean, what's wrong with the ethical structure? That's a core assumption that we make with this system, that people would act at least at a minimally acceptable ethical structure. But those kind of core assumptions were off limits, and that we're seeing that with science now and how science is being used in COVID, and we're seeing that with a lot of the assumptions we've made about governance and its willingness to protect us and things like that. So it evolved in my mind, and I'm trying to grapple with this to write a bidding report, and then I have a article I have to write too about it. Is that it's maybe potentially being a mechanism for why civilizations fail. So if you read Diamond, it will say that it's because of our environmental problems or other big system problems that come in from the outside. Or if you read Tainter, Joseph Tainter, he would say that it's because every time we make reform, it is more expensive, and eventually those expenses mount up, and the costs of operating the system are higher than the benefits you receive from that system. So every time you reform an institution, it gets more and more expensive to run, but you have to reform it in order to adapt to the existing environment that you're operating in. And that eventually those costs become so negative across the board, across all your institutions, that your entire system just collapses. And so this is a slightly different one. It goes in and says, okay, every institution, everything we do across the board, and from culture to building an agency, is predicated on these assumptions that we make. Assumptions, that this will solve this, and this is the way to solve this problem, and that you start to build these things, and you build assumption upon assumption upon assumption upon assumption, and you get this kind of ziggurat, this monster pile of assumptions by the time you're as advanced and modern as we are right now. And obviously, what happens over time is that the conditions change, the operational environment changes, the world changes, the demands on the systems that we've built with these assumptions change. And they don't perform like they used to. And we're seeing, a lot of the assumptions we have deeper in the pile, especially the core ones, start to fall away. They're completely rotten. They're completely ineffective. And you get gaps in the structure, and all of the assumptions built on top of them start to collapse in on top of those rotten areas. My friend Joe Hall called it rot reveal. And so every crisis shows a gap in the structure where assumptions that the core assumption has failed, and that throughout, as we deal with the crisis, more of these assumptions collapse. It's like the reveal causes a kind of a cascade of collapse.
I'm restoring an old sailboat right now that's older than I am. And at first I thought there was 5 things I had to fix. And then I fixed some of those 5 things. And now there's 10 things I have to fix. And now part of the mast just fell apart. And I don't even know if the wood's rotten itself. Everything I fix, I discover there's 5 more things that are broken. And as far as I can tell in sailing, that's always the case unless you're buying new.
Right.
There's a point at which it's a boat made in 1982. There is no fixing it to where it's fixed. But if I act like I'll just put another $2,000, I'll be good. That's assumption rot right there.
Yeah, you're dealing with assumption rot, and we have a whole system of media and governance and academia that's tied to the existing system and the assumptions that were used to build it. They've learned them, they've made careers on them, they make their money from those assumptions, and when those assumptions start to fail, are proven to be rotten, they defend them. And they make it impossible for us to even discuss whether or not they're valid anymore. When you do question the system, and I've been running into this ever since it really became apparent to not just me, but to a lot of people during the financial crisis, when nobody went to jail or nothing was really done after that event, and anyone who watched what was going on could see it occur in real time. It was transparent enough to actually see the rot, exposed. Is that you weren't allowed to ask the questions, that nobody at any kind of serious level who had some power would actually allow those questions to be asked, and they were pushed off the media stage, and no one would revisit them even later, even when they're proven. And so we're seeing that again and again. We're seeing this in Afghanistan. This whole retreat had all of these decision-making failures, and revealed some core rot in our decision-making process. How we make decisions in the DoD and in the national security machine, and how we react to new information, how we react to changing environments, and that has to be looked at, but there won't be looked at. It's already starting to move into the partisan realm, and you have people saying it was a great success, and then anyone who actually says anything else, like Bagram, and you have who was it, the economist from the New York Times, Nobel laureate, what was his name?
Krugman.
I was going to say,
yeah, he's going
New York Times.
Yeah, it was a classic kind of partisan attack, know nothing attack, and said, anyone who mentions Bagram is basically saying, ivermectin. It's the ivermectin of Afghanistan. Is that it's turned into disinfo when it was just a clear, going to a defensible airport, maybe prepositioning some of the people that wanted to evacuate that had, valid visas weeks before, when it was apparent that they were losing the country. It would have been, a very simple thing to do, would have given us lots of options. We could have flown air support from it, and then we could have retreated and, with a little bit of dignity and a lot more safety. But it's treated as ivermectin. So, I'm not a fan necessarily of ivermectin. I mean, I use it for rosacea, which is the topical use, but that the connection between anti-parasitical and antiviral hasn't been made in my head. And the information is too fluid for me to come down one way or another.
That's a different live stream.
Yeah, that's a different live stream. So, but the thing is, they basically brand valid military decision making as and critique as disinfo.
Well, it's dissent. It's the choosing that dissent
Right.
means you're not patriotic, which is really dangerous. And it's not gone well for empires in the past when they decide that dissent from the current general, president, whatever, is unpatriotic and you deserve to die or have your reputation killed. Doesn't go well.
Yeah.
When you're talking about,
you can't question anything now. I mean, it's like anything that involves any kind of, problem that you, like, for instance, border closings. Okay. During the early days of COVID, I mean, I wrote a report on COVID back in January and said there was called a pandemic, right? It was clear that's the way it was going. If we closed the borders for a couple months between February, maybe in July or so, we would have had that grace period to correct all the other mistakes that we made in terms of, screwing up the initial batch of testing in March. So we had 0 tests, early March. I think we had maybe 300 nationally, right? Nothing in terms of testing. We didn't have any PPE because we outsourced it all based on this, idea, this core assumption that free trade was the be all and end all, that would always be available to us just in time. That, no matter what happened in the future, we're better off with that than we are maintaining some level of domestic production of things that we find, essential during crisis. So we had 95% of our PPE was being, personal protective equipment for hospitals and for, my wife's operating room nurse, and she didn't have N95s. They had one that they had to reuse again, day after day after day, while dealing.
That's not what it says on the instructions. You're not supposed to do that.
Well, I mean, if you're in the hospital, you're a doctor or a nurse, you're going to be exposed to incredible viral loads. I mean, yeah, it will overwhelm any system, and when it hits you, it's going to hit you with like a battering ram, even if you're 20. It's just a different environment in that kind of hostile environment. But we didn't have any of that. So assumptions, we're rotten, and we can't ask the core questions. We couldn't ask it about the border closing because a core assumption about the United States that nobody seems to want to address is that it's always going to be open to everybody in the world at all times, and that closing that, for me, that's a minor inconvenience. I like to travel internationally. I've worked almost every continent in the world in a military capacity, flown all over everywhere. As much as I love going to the rest of the world, it makes sense to me that if you don't know, the extent to which this virus would be a pandemic, and you don't know a lot about it, is that you recognize that people can fly in from any direction with a click of a button. They don't have to just come from China. Is that you shut down all the air travel into the United States, all of the travel coming in.
Which gets to the assumption of I, as an American, have the right to travel anywhere in the world whenever I want to, and no one gets to tell me no. Because being an American,
come in. Right.
I get to go anywhere and come back whenever I want, which is just, it is how I've always lived, but it's not obvious that in the case of this kind of crisis, like that assumption, which I lived with, didn't even speak out loud really, it's now there. I want to hear from Mike. One of the things you do, Mike, is your situational awareness on your YouTube most weekdays. And it occurs to me that one of the things, if we were to distill what's in situational awareness, part of that is you're pointing out assumptions that just aren't true, like saying, you look at what you believe. This is not true. Stop believing it. Ideally, before people start relying on it too much.
Yeah, look, information is a sharp weapon, right? You can impale your opponent with it, and you can also cut yourself with it. And so on the intel side, we have key assumptions. We're never going to know all the facts. In most cases, facts are going to be very sparse. And this really underscores the importance of having a skilled and experienced analysis section. And so we make key assumptions. And one of the most important things, if you are going to make a key assumption, you don't have enough facts. So we're going to say, we don't know that this is the case, but let's just make a key assumption. This is the case. Then what? And if you're going to make a key assumption, you should periodically do an assumption check. And there's a thing called linchpin analysis, where you go through an analysis, a white paper or whatever, and you identify the key assumption. And you say, okay, what is the linchpin of this argument? You think about a train, right? And they used to be all held together by these linchpins. And so you got this train going up a hill. And what happens if I pull out this linchpin? Is this half this train going to go rolling back down the hill? And that's what you want to identify that before the catastrophe happens. And so doing an assumptions check is a countermeasure for assumptions rot. And and as far as what we do, there are a lot of bad assumptions that are made just by the general public. But again, I don't necessarily blame Johnny or Susie. Maybe they do have some culpability by believing information that is wrong, and maybe they would otherwise, if they did some investigation, figure it out for themselves. But we live in a very contested information environment, and it's not just a left-right thing; it's a class thing, and now also it's an international, it's a foreign adversary thing. It's gray zone warfare inside the United States, because information, people think about it, it's a blunt force object. No, it is a dagger.
Right. Yeah. The Marshall McLuhan idea that the next World War III wasn't going to be a nuclear exchange, and it wasn't. It's a global information war where there's no dividing line between civilians and the military. Everybody's a participant, and we're in that right now in the post-Cold War environment, and it's been growing in intensity, and it's affecting our domestic politics. I mean, there are so many participants, and there's so many. It's a multinodal kind of conflict. There isn't just two sides or two ideologies in this. Even the political spectrum that we see in the U.S. has changed. It's not the classic left-right, depending on the size of the government that you want. It's a contest between consensus and dissent, and or those who seek universal consensus, agreement on a single idea. We should do this, and then we're going to try to coerce everybody into agreement that this is what we should do. And those who would disagree, too much on one side, and you get a China situation, which is saying, okay, here's how everybody should live their lives based on Confucianism. This is ideal family, and this is how you can only have 3 hours of game time a week. That they just told everyone under 18. We can't play computer games more than 3 hours a week, which seems good, but it's enforced from the top down. Everything is constrained. Or you have more like Russia, where you have chaos to a certain extent. Everything is dissent. You can't agree on anything. And that's not good either. So you need some kind of balance between them. You need a dynamic. You need, the dissent there to break up a consensus that is not delivering results, that maybe has outlived its usefulness, that needs to go. But you need consensus sometimes to get things done that are critical. Okay, and a way to have that interact in a positive way is something we're going to learn. It's very similar to when the printing press hit in Europe because of the 30 Years' War, the whole Protestant Reformation, lots and lots of chaos, lots and lots of fights, millions of pamphlets being printed for everything in terms of politics, in terms of religious diversity. It's chaos. It took a long time to figure out how to make that whole system work. That we could have a democratic government based on a document, the printed document, like a constitution. We could have markets and financial systems with like counting records. They're printed, right? They could have, all of this system work in a way that achieves some level of positive arrow of development, meaning that we're going to get better and see more progress over time, that we'll be wealthier and more well off. And we're going through that now with the advent of the internet and social networking. And this World War III that we're seeing, this contest is all over, trying to find that solution. And a lot of people want to own that solution. They want to dictate it. We went high level on that one.
I have a question for each of you to wrap up with, which is, what is the best thing that a person can do right now who agrees with most of what you said, that they understand that they're in the midst of OODA Shear and assumption rot, and that it's getting harder to tell what's actually happening? What's a concrete step that someone can take to defend themselves against that?
Hook yourself up with good networks. Okay, so you don't think as an individual anymore. There's too much information to process. You know how, like, if you thought as an individual in a slow-moving environment, yeah, you can read a bunch of different sources and you kind of level set yourself through this gathering your own information. In a fast-moving environment with a ton of information, it's torrential flow of information. You can't do it on your own. Things change too quickly. The frameworks and the assumptions that are in play are constant motion, and the only way to actually make sense of it all is to find networks of people where some level of high quality thinking is being done, and those people will help level set you, keep you even, keep you upright, even though the world is in chaos. And then there's no one solution. There's no like go off into the woods and hide yourself and disconnect and you'll be safe. You might become a target that way, or you live a crappy life that way, or you know there isn't any single solution I can give you. And I think Mike would agree on this, is that you have to engage with the moment. You have to engage with the world on an ongoing basis, and surround yourself with great networks and great people.
I love that answer. And folks, on the screen here is John's Patreon, where I've had some of the best conversations about what is happening and what's happening next. And John, you've managed to gather together a bunch of people who value, I'll call it an attempt at clear thinking over partisan politics, which is a triumph in this age. And occasionally partisanship rears its head, and then we smack it back down and try to get people thinking clearly again. But that's just a wonderful place for anybody. And it's one of these, the cost to get in is very low. It's more than zero, but it's not zero, which makes it completely different than Twitter or any of the other places.
Yeah, I find you actually have to have a little bit of a barrier, more than like it's $5 a month. In this case, it prevents people from what I call being a drive-by. So people will come in, wreck the place, shit all over you, and then leave, right? And you see that a lot on Twitter, right? It's always drive-bys. People going, oh, they don't even spend the time to even read your tweet before they crap all over you. So and also it's, and I'm sure that Mike has the same thing with his group, is that it's self-selecting, is that the people who actually go through the process of thinking through this stuff and spend time in it tend to be high quality people to hang around with and think through things. So they tend to be more courteous. And the classic thing is, like, if you want to have a good discussion with people, you have to be at base courteous, right? And then you have to be willing to try to find common ground on things that you can both agree on, and build from there without all the assumptions about what the other person is.
Well, I am publishing more stuff on culture and politics on my Twitter feed right now. All my best conversations are still in John's Patreon, because it's this cloistered space where we can have detailed, long, nuanced conversations that wouldn't work on Twitter because you'd be taken out of context. Whereas, there might be 5 of us out of the hundreds of people there having a conversation about something, and John may or may not chime in as we're discussing some point. So I love the answer of tribe. Now, Mike, what is your answer for a concrete step that someone can take to deal with all this assumption rot, etc.?
We have to bring back some level of critical thinking. That education system we have it's just force fed. Here, memorize these facts, take the test, and maybe you can graduate reading at a 9th grade level, maybe. And we used to have this 48-hour rule back during the Trump administration, right? It's CNN or whoever would come out with something. Well, let's wait 48 hours. And if it's still true in 48 hours, then, maybe there's some credibility there. And so the first thing, like we talk about human intelligence, right? It's, you don't just have to analyze the information that this human source has produced. You have to ask, who is the source, and what are what are her motivations for telling us this information? And that is an element of critical thinking that I think is lost on the public in general. And I'm not trying to be a downer, but we need to start looking at, in addition to source reliability, we need to start looking at source motivations. Why is this headline coming out, and why does it say what it says right now, today?
Yeah, every post, every tweet is a psyop in a
Right.
global information war. I mean, no matter who you are, everything going up is some kind of psyop. Either somebody's promoting something or somebody's trying to push their political beliefs, or they might not even know it if they're part of a tribe. They are just amplifying the tribal message or the tribal narrative. It's just part of who they are and how they've been rewarded in time to do it. But yeah, everything is a psyop. Figuring that out helps you a lot.
It does. Mike, can you tell us real quick about your attempt to help people get more information through your early warning brief?
Yeah, first I'd like to say thanks, John and Brian, for having me on. I really enjoy this conversation. And John, I'd like to talk with you and maybe collaborate on some stuff, get your take on a few things as well. So yeah, the company's called Forward Observer. We have a product called Early Warning. It comes out every day. We have a free product, and then we have, in the free product is stuff you're not going to hear about in the news, but stuff that we think are important. And we're veterans. Dustin's a former Army PSYOP guy, and then the Early Warning is us putting the pieces of the puzzle together, and kind of long form analysis on, and we track extremist groups, economic instability, and things that are happening in the political and government sphere that are very concerning to us for the future.
Love it. Folks, if you got value out of this live stream, go ahead and share it far and wide. You can help your own friends and family get a little bit better about thinking by thinking a little bit less bad and being better at noticing their own assumptions. For any questions you have, we have the Twitter feeds. These two gents, we have Gray Zone Warlord is Mike. We have @JohnRobb for John. So go ahead and you can ask any questions directly over there. And also let John know who else you'd like to hear a live stream from. We've done these mostly either on my podcast or inside the private Patreon here for John's Patreon. We're just starting to do some more live that anybody can go and join in. So give John some feedback. And thank you for showing up. This is me. I'm over at Redbeard Brian. And then that's where I podcast. I talk more about businessy things as opposed to all of these things that John talks about. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Brian.